everyone, and welcome to Seakeepers Voyages of Discovery. I'm your host, Katie Sheehan. In honor of Shark Awareness Day on July 14th, today's episode dives into a story that started with fear and evolved into fascination. We're exploring how Jaws, the blockbuster that terrified a generation, also sparked a global movement to protect sharks. Joining me are two extraordinary guests, Wendy Benchley, ocean advocate and co-founder of the Peter Benchley Ocean Awards, whose life was forever changed by her late husband's legendary novel, and Dr. Mike Heithaus from the Heithaus Lab at Florida International University, whose research is redefining everything we thought we knew about sharks, from misunderstood monsters to essential architects of healthy oceans. From media myths to marine science, today's conversation is all about shifting the shark narrative. Let's dive in. So, Wendy, I have a really loaded question for you. What do sharks mean to you?
Well, sharks mean to me a healthy ocean. Honestly, that's what they mean to me. And I've certainly been part of the generation that saw the depletion of sharks because of shark finning. So definitely Peter and I diving, even in the 80s, we found it harder and harder when we were on trips with the National Geographic or ABC Sportsman or any other, harder and harder to find sharks. So it's been going on for many, many years. And of course, I always bring up shark finning as the main culprit for the slaughter of almost, I think it's now 75 million sharks a year, but it used to be over 200 million a year. Wow. And that came basically from the increase in the middle class in China and Asian countries because shark fin soup was something that they served at festivities, weddings, and other banquets. So that's something that I've been working on over the years, to work with groups that have done a really good job of educating the Chinese. And they, of course, want to be good citizens. So once they understood that shark fin soup, actually taking the fins off, killed the creature, Wild Aid, I'm on the board of Wild Aid, and we worked hard in China and brought down the demand for shark fin soup by 80%. It took us 15 years, but we did bring down the demand. So there's a lot more work to do. I think the sharks are still being absolutely slaughtered at an unsustainable rate. So, Mike, I hope your work is going to help us bring them back.
Well, that's what we're working on. And I actually had the opposite flow in terms of what I saw of shark populations. So I started my work as a graduate student in remote Western Australia, which is a place with very few people. I mean, I think there were less people within about 100 miles of me than were on the 747 flying over to Australia. And they also had really good fisheries management, especially for sharks. And so I arrived at a spot where sharks were just everywhere. And you had big tiger sharks. And then after I finished that work, I came to Florida and was told I was going to work in a spot with tons of sharks. And I was just shocked that it would take us weeks to see as many large sharks as we saw in half a day in Australia. That really very quickly drove home in the early 2000s just where we were. And there were studies at the time just starting to really come out and say that we may have lost 90% or more sharks in some areas. And so you start off thinking you're studying the behavior and the biology and the importance to these animals, and all of a sudden you're in the middle of a big conservation issue as well. And so I think a lot of the work that we've been doing is really trying to show those links of how sharks can function in ecosystems and why we want them. And you've seen places where they get management right, you can keep shark populations even when there's plenty of fishing going on. But if you don't get it right, they just get wiped out because they take so long to mature. They have so few offspring. And so we just did this giant collaboration across the entire world, the Global Fin Print Project. We're doing the second iteration of that now 5 years later to see how management's working. But in that initial stint where we had hundreds of scientists around the world collaborating together, we ended up with 20% of reefs where we basically saw no sharks at all, and probably half of them severely depleted. So the problem is very acute. And we're seeing that demand change, which Wendy mentioned, and Wild Aid and a lot of other groups are really working on that. But the thing we have to work on now is as demand for fins goes down, there are trying to find more markets for shark meat.
Exactly.
And as we get better tools genetically to identify where shark products came from, and we can say whether it was from a sustainably fished population or not, the unsustainable fishing is now going through one port to lots of different ones. So we're having new challenges. So it's an issue we can't take our eyes off.
Yes, I was going to bring that up, that one of the sad things is, of course, the middlemen, and they're very smart. So they're promoting shark meat now much more aggressively. So we definitely need to get more coordinated efforts that way. So just tell me, what are you finding in this worldwide survey?
Well, I think the main things we found in the first survey, besides the fact that coral reef sharks were in big trouble. Number one, we don't see a lot of the real apex sharks the way we should, except in a few places. So the big tiger sharks, the hammerheads, the bull sharks, those are the ones that may have the biggest effects on ecosystems. And they're in the biggest trouble, not surprisingly, because the big ones tend to get taken out first. But I think the other thing we saw is that there are these reservoirs of hope. So there are places where you have pretty big human populations and you still have robust shark populations. And it's usually because those are areas where the community has a lot of voice in governance. So fishing communities are kind of part of making decisions. And in general, they're not using gill nets and long lines. So these couple very simple things can help you protect sharks, but you can switch to line fishing and other methods that are more targeted, where you can still have very vibrant fishing communities, but populations of sharks that are doing what they should do ecologically.
Yeah. So where are you finding that around the world? Or just a couple of hotspots of...
Yeah, the Bahamas is a great example of a place in the Caribbean. And the Caribbean for coral reefs is a very long history of heavy exploitation. So generally is not in quite as good a shape as the Pacific. French Polynesia is really incredible in terms of the number of sharks. And there, especially the remote atolls, are in really good shape. So those are a few of those. But then the other thing we've been starting to do is try to figure out which countries, and Madagascar is an example of this, where the sharks are in trouble, but they're not completely wiped out. And you've got a lot of scope to rebound. So you have a few changes you could make to fisheries management or how people fish, and you could potentially rebuild those populations. Because for me, that's really where we need to change the conversation. It used to be just protect what we've got left. But now what we need is to rebuild to where we used to be, so that these animals are not just there, but they're there in the numbers and the sizes we need to have them play the roles in ecosystems they used to play.
So that's wonderful to hear that you're seeing these spots around the globe. And then, of course, there's the wonderful comeback of the seals and the great whites along the northeast coast of the United States and Canada. I do a lot of speaking about that because people along the northeast coast were very used to swimming in waters where there weren't great whites. And now suddenly, how dare they? How dare they be in my ocean? But most people, I think now, there's been a big change in attitude, and they understand how important sharks are.
Yeah, and I wanted to touch on that a little bit and just jump back to something Mike said. It sounds a little counterintuitive, but you were describing these very populated human areas on the coast with robust shark populations. And you think, oh, maybe the sharks would be where the people aren't or something. And you talk about these fishing policies that help. That we have this perception that maybe sharks and people shouldn't be in the same area or shouldn't be swimming in the same waters. How do you both feel about that perception? And is that right or wrong? Or how should we feel about being in the same areas as sharks?
Well, I can just speak right up and say, I mean, there have always been sharks in the water where human beings are swimming. It makes me laugh sometimes when I see the videos of the Florida coast and hundreds, thousands of people swimming away, and yay for them. Why not? But there are hundreds of sharks swimming just off the coast beyond them. So I think we've always been in the water with sharks and other fish, and we've learned how to be more wise about it, I hope. So I think, as Mike is saying, different areas of the world present different situations for human beings. The Northeast, when Peter was young and he fished with his dad off the coast of Nantucket, there were thousands of sharks. I mean, sometimes they couldn't even get a blue or a bass into the boat without a shark grabbing it. Then the sharks were fished out. They went away. There was a big dip in it. And then the seals were protected about 30 years ago with the Magnuson-Stevenson Act. The seals came back and the great whites came back. So it's a success story. It's an ecological success story there. I do think people are understanding that now, and they swim with more wisdom in the ocean. They don't swim way, way out. There's the White Shark Conservancy up there now. I know there are boats that go out to try to view sharks. People are tagging them. And one interesting thing is, and Mike, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but from what I read and understand, you need those white sharks there in order to keep the seal populations under control. Without those great whites, the seals would multiply exponentially. Now, when there's going to be a balance, nobody knows. But we need those great whites to keep the seals. So the waters are beginning to be as alive with sharks and seals as they maybe were 50 years ago. Right, Mike?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you make a great point. And I mean, in terms of the swimming with sharks, I think most of the time it's not something you even think about. Here in South Florida, it's more dangerous to drive to the beach than to get in the water. But
Right.
it is important to know that as we have some of these conservation success stories, which are great, but they're limited to a few places. So globally, we still have big problems. But as we bring back big white sharks and we bring back big tigers and bulls, those are animals you need to be wary of and aware of. And, you may want to get out of the water if you see them, unless you're in a situation where you know what you're doing and there are people who know what they're doing. So there are places around the world, and I think one would be off that coast of Massachusetts during the seal season. You want to be somewhere else or not in the water when the sharks are there. But it's always amazing to me, actually, how few bites there are relative to how many encounters there are between people and sharks a year. There are probably millions. And Chris Lowe at Cal State Long Beach has been working on these white sharks and their interactions with people. And there are tens of thousands probably of encounters happening almost daily with the number of surfers in the water, which is right in the nursery area of these great whites. And I think that Chris's work shows how often those encounters are happening, but how infrequently the shark even cares about the surfboard or the people. And so some of the bites may even be people running into sleeping sharks. And so we don't want to overblow the danger, but rip currents, sharks, talk to local lifeguards and people and know the ocean, because the ocean can be dangerous in many ways if you're not careful. But for the most part, I'm looking for places to be able to be in the water with sharks.
Yes,
And
exactly.
it's amazing to see them underwater. And I think that in North America, especially, we just aren't used to dealing with predators on land or in the ocean. And what you see when you go to other parts of the world where predator populations haven't been reduced as much, people learn to live with these animals, because it doesn't matter land, freshwater, saltwater. You pretty much want these big apex predators there to maintain ecosystems. So we got to learn to live together and get their populations back to ecologically meaningful numbers, which we may be starting to see in some places in the US with these white sharks off, and Canada now, even with the white sharks and the seals.
Mike, I'm so glad you mentioned Dr. Chris Lowe. We did an episode with sharks on the podcast last year, and it was really incredible because he was talking similarly about the human-shark interactions and how we can coexist in the same waters as we always have, but how amazing it is to see the drone footage of all the surfers and the swimmers and all the sharks swimming around them. And in my time at Seakeepers, I've gotten to interact with sharks on tagging expeditions, and it's been an absolutely incredible experience. I'll send my family pictures in the water with sharks. And they're based in Colorado. So, of course, they freak out and they're all worried. And it's amazing because being in the water with them, you're, of course, attentive and cautious, especially when you're swimming with them. You do your 360s in the water. You keep an eye out, but they're really beautiful and curious, and they have personalities. So I think everyone needs to be in the water with a shark at some point to truly understand how significant and impactful they are.
I agree with you. Let's just talk about the beauty of these sharks. Because when Peter asked me what I'd like to do for our 40th wedding anniversary, I said, I want to go to Guadalupe and do cage diving with the big, beautiful female great whites. So off we went. We did it. I got into the cage, and I was the first in the cage because for many years, Peter had always been the first in the cage. And then I got in and just saw the tail going away. So this time I was the first in the cage, and we had sometimes 4 and 5 of these gorgeous, huge females. And as you all know, they don't wiggle like a fish. They just cruise. So they came by very slowly, and they'd come right close to the cage and sort of eyeball us. And a couple of times I could put my hand out and stroke it from head to tail. And it was soft, not soft, but more like a leather glove. And then do it the other way, and the denticles in the skin were rough. So it was just a glorious, exciting time to see these beautiful creatures up close. And so when we talk about conservation and sharks, I always wish that I could have everybody have that experience or just a little bit of that experience to realize how truly magnificent they are and how ancient they are. Here they are, what, 450 million years old? It's just a wonder, a fabulous thing to see. So I'm glad you work with them, Mike. And tell me, I'm just taking a little offshoot here because one of the things I talk about is that Jaws, yes, scared people, but Jaws also jump-started interest in sharks. And I've met so many scientists who say, oh, I just wanted to be Hooper. I saw Jaws and I wanted to get into shark research. Also, Sonny Goober, who was the head of the Rosenstiel School, Sonny told me once that after Jaws, there was a 30% increase in the number of people applying for marine science there. For me and for Peter, it was a wonderful thing to know that Jaws, yes, scared, but boy, it fascinated and got people really active and interested.
Yeah, there is no question it inspired a lot of my colleagues to go into sharks. I actually credit Jaws with me becoming a pretty good swimmer because it scared me so much as an 8-year-old kid that the deep end of the pool, I would swim as fast as I could to get back to the shallow end. Even though I knew there was no shark in the deep end of the pool, that little part of your brain that says danger, danger, danger after I saw that movie was ringing for about 4 years. So I think that got me in pretty good shape there. And I think that's part of it too. And I mean, I grew up in the cornfields of Ohio, went to see grandma in Naples, Florida, around the beach and loved to go fishing. But that fear is there. And I think part of that's that when we are in the ocean and you are in deep water, there's nothing you can do. It's like being in the woods at night when it's dark, even if you know there are no wolves or predators there. Your brain just starts saying, I'm at risk here. And when I first started getting in the water with sharks, believe me, that was what was going off. I'd spent years putting tags on, working with animals, camera tags on them, and hadn't spent a lot of time in the water. And it really wasn't until some of these documentary films started going that I started diving. I just remember the first time getting in the water with some of these big animals. I mean, I went through my tank about 3 times faster than normal, but then you get to see how they behave and the way they are. You do get to really appreciate these animals and how graceful they are, how they are not mindless killing machines going to bite everything. They can be boring at times, which is good. I think the one neat thing you mentioned, Wendy, is that they have personalities. And you certainly see that when you're working with the same animals at a site where they're being fed. You've got the ones that stand off, the ones that will come in. And one of the sites here off Florida, I've seen lemon sharks come in with a hook in their mouth and actually swim up to the person at the feeding site and just sink until they took the hook out. So they're kind of treat us as cleaning stations. But we're also seeing that in our research too. And so we've been studying these baby bull sharks in coastal waters of Florida for, I don't want to date myself, but about 15 years now. And what we found is that these baby bull sharks, they're ones that look like they're bold and they swim up and down. They go take risks where they might get eaten by bigger sharks to feed. And then we've got the couch potatoes. They're the scaredy cats that just sit way up in these river systems where there's not as much food, but they don't have to worry about predators. And we see that those behavioral differences persist over years. And so now we're trying to figure out, what does that mean? Do the ones that take risks maybe get eaten more often, but they grow faster and can get out about their business in the ocean sooner when they get big enough? And we're starting to see that repeated again and again in the science. And I think that's kind of a neat thing that we lose sometimes. We just talk about the science, and you just can't beat sitting back and observing the oceans, sharks, animals, and just appreciating them before you start diving into what's the question and what's the science. And I think for me, that's been one of the real special things, is getting that time to be in the water with these animals. Because I think, to Wendy's point, most people want to do the right thing. And so we need those education programs that make sure that people know that shark fin soup or some fishing is causing problems, but then also that just appreciation. And it reminds me of a quote of Lawrence Frank, who studied hyenas and lions. And he was asked, why do we need them? And he went to not just these are important he just said, wouldn't the world be a worse place if we didn't have these animals in them? So to me, there's intrinsic value of having these amazing animals in our oceans.
Oh, yes. Can you imagine the ocean of the planet just without, well, I don't think we'd survive. I mean, I think they're more important than just for their intrinsic value. I think the whole web of life can be just destroyed if it's destroyed.
We're seeing that, Wendy, off the Bermuda, where we've lost tiger sharks.
Yes.
Green turtle populations explode, and they just mowed down all the seagrass. And people might say, why do I care about sharks? Well, in that case, when those sharks disappear, turtles mow the seagrass, and that seagrass is where the conch and the grouper grow up that people are dependent on. And so if we don't rebalance that ecosystem, it's going to have major effects. And so we see this around the world, and similar thing with white sharks off California. It looks like the fear of white sharks has actually helped, where it's pushed these sea otters into some of these bays. They're eating the invertebrates that wipe out the seagrass. And so now we have healthy seagrass and elkhorn slough. And it may be because white sharks are coming back and scaring otters from the coastline into these bays. And so I think that we know so little about sharks, but where we do look, we're seeing they can be more important than you would expect. But it's no surprise to people who have studied wolves, lions, and big predators on land. They're playing the same role in oceans.
Yes, and I'm interested that you bring up the seagrass because, of course, that is a carbon sink and a really important carbon sink in the ocean. So I know the Bahamas is now protecting their seagrass beds. They're very extensive. So that's another fascinating angle.
Wendy, you've mentioned Peter a couple times now, and I would just love to clarify. This is Peter Benchley, the author of Jaws. I don't think we've mentioned that. So I would love to know a little bit more about your relationship with him and the role that sharks played in your marriage. And you have 40 years of scuba diving experience. So what came first, the love of sharks and then the lifestyle, or was it the other way around?
Katie, so Peter and I were just so fortunate for him to write this book, Jaws. We were down, he was writing speeches for LBJ, and LBJ decided not to run. Peter thought, all right, this is my one chance not to go back to Newsweek to write, but to try freelance writing. So we had 2 little kids. So we lived in other people's houses, and he did some freelance writing. He wasn't making enough money. So he thought, we were young and foolish, right? Well, if you're not making enough money freelancing, let's try to write a novel. So he had 2 ideas for a novel, one about pirates and one about a great white that just hovered around. And Doubleday liked the great white, the fish story, as they called it. So Peter just sat down and wrote it. And he was always very proud of the fact that the first 3 chapters of that book and the description of the shark, nobody ever changed a word. He had a much more complicated plot than the movie. But it was, for us, it opened up the world of the ocean. What a lucky guy he was, and how lucky I was. So we did go off on expeditions with National Geographic. We had 2 small kids, so I was at home much of the time, but on some expeditions with him. And I got deeply involved in Princeton politics, was elected as a Princeton Borough Councilwoman for 10 years. I worked hard on environmental issues, but the ocean just became an integral, deep-seated part of our life. And we were horrified that some people took Jaws as an excuse to go out and murder sharks and have a lot of shark tournaments. So we just did whatever we could. I was on the board of Environmental Defense Fund then, and Peter was a spokesperson for EDF. So he would do speeches and I would be the policy wonk there to help him out when people were asking too many detailed questions about the ocean and the policies and what was going on. So the ocean was just so much a part of our life, and we felt so lucky that was it. And remember, this was in the 70s, so we grew up with the rest of the world in the environmental movement. I mean, in the 70s, we all thought the ocean was so vast. We could do anything to it. We could dump garbage. We could massacre the species. And so we learned with everybody else how important it was and the tragedy that was beginning to happen. And I think the full-blown knowledge of that ocean tragedy occurred late 90s, early 2000s. And that's when we all thought, oh, we have really got to work hard at this to bring back the ocean. And of course, we all then knew that climate was also destroying the ocean with the carbon.
And I think one thing that Wendy mentioned that to me was amazing is just how recently we realized that sharks were in trouble. I mean, it wasn't until the 90s that even the first papers like Jack Musick really started to bring it to life. And then it was almost another decade before other papers came out that really said sharks are in trouble. So when I started my PhD in the late 90s, sharks are in trouble really wasn't on the radar. And by the time I finished my PhD a few years later, it's, oh my gosh, this is a really big problem.
Wow.
And so I think it's incredible how quickly we've come relative to Falling Clean Water, Clean Air Act, and a much earlier history of what's going on land. And I mean, I get it. When you fly over the ocean, you just think, how on earth could people have an effect on something this big and vast? But when you start to look at some of the dashboards now and you see how many boats are out there, the amount of illegal fishing and undocumented fishing going on, and how much effort is behind that, you start to see how easy it is to do bad things to the ocean. And then when you add the pollution, the carbon issues, we got a big effort, but I think it's very hopeful to see the amount of attention and effort. And the good thing on oceans is it's a little bit harder than on land to get every last thing. And so you do have these reservoirs of hope. You've got these places we can rebuild from. So if we can get the policies right and we can balance things, we can have awesome, healthy ocean ecosystems and the human uses we need from the oceans. And I think that's the story. And it's what a lot of marine biologists are working on, which actually, Wendy, is one thing I want to ask about because almost nobody talks about this. One of the things in Jaws that I appreciate the most is actually not the shark. It's the marine biologist, because it is incredible how poorly scientists are portrayed on screen in books. There's always this horrible, flawed character or well-meaning and naive. We don't get a good run. And so Jaws is one of the few where the marine biologist can be a normal human and an unwitting hero. So I've always appreciated that component of the Jaws piece that never really gets mentioned.
That's very nice to hear. I mean, I always know that people wanted to be a Hooper, but you're right. He was a living, breathing human, really exciting guy out there on the ocean doing the research. And that brings up Peter and the book he wrote. Peter basically did not think of this shark as a monster in any way. This was just a normal great white shark doing what animals do. You born, you eat, and you die. And in the process, if you hang around, then you can cause some chaos in this little town. And of course, Jaws also was more about the people, honestly, than the shark. It was about the people's reaction to a menace that they couldn't control. And how did they cope with it? So I thank you, Mike. I'm glad to hear that Hooper was right up there as one of the heroes. Yeah, that's nice.
Maybe that's through my lens as a scientist, but
Yeah. I think it's great. So back to Katie, to your question. One hopeful, wonderful conversation I wanted to bring up is how powerful marine protected areas are in regenerating life for the ocean. And the statistics, if you will leave the ocean alone in big enough areas, the fish will grow, they will swim out, and there will be more fish for us to catch and eat, and more fish to keep the ocean healthy. So that's what I really work hard on with WildAid, with their Marine Protected Area program. And they've done an excellent job with a model where they have local people involved, local government people involved. They teach people how to monitor, whether it's boats or radar or other things, so that they can do it by themselves and keep carrying on, even if WildAid just comes back to check once a year. And I know Seakeepers is really deeply involved in helping with those issues also. So we do have a way to regenerate the ocean If we can just get enough of these, you all know that we all are saying by 2030, we'd love 30% of the ocean. But I like the idea of having the high seas no-take zones. If we could do the high seas and then let people fish in their EEZs, maybe this is getting too detailed, but I think if we could do even half of the high seas, the population growth would be astonishing. And I'm thinking especially of the huge area now off the west coast of South America. It is massive now. Many, many NGOs and governments have been working on this. And we now have 2 or 3 huge marine protected area with swimways connecting them. So that if we could show a map on this podcast, people would be thrilled to see how massive this area is. And I think that's going to help exponentially to repopulate the Pacific.
Mike, what do you think of that? What do you think of the idea that if we protect our high seas and let people still fish and utilize the exclusive economic zones, which are 200 nautical miles off the coast of a coastal country, do you think that that would be an effective path forward to restoring some of our oceanic ecosystems?
We definitely need high seas protected areas. So I think that it's the patchwork. And the great thing is with the tags we can put on animals now, we can see where populations are when. You could create zones that would help protect enough. And I think one of the important things is sometimes people say, okay, there's illegal fishing in some protected areas or they're not perfect. They don't have to be perfect. They just need to reduce the amount of stuff coming out of the oceans, because it's just getting that balance of reducing how much we take to the point where the populations can maintain it. So this big protected area that's multi-nation, from Costa Rica, Panama, down into South America, these big seamounts and islands. It's huge because it protects a big portion of the life cycle of some of these animals. And so you can then have fishing outside of it and you kind of grow it and have this spillover effect. So the big protected areas work because they do give you something to monitor and enforce as well, even if it's not perfect. So I do think that's important. The one thing we're finding, though, is that if you have those protected areas and then add some amount of traditional fisheries management, like changing the gear types or size quotas, if you put those two together, it is super powerful for making sure that you even have these big sharks. Because, I mean, the one trick with some of our most important sharks, those tigers, the whites, is that they cover thousands and thousands of miles. They go from the coastal EEZs out into the high seas, from one EEZ to the next countries. And so you do need to have some of these big protected areas where those animals don't go from being protected and then immediately overfish just outside of them, because we need those big individuals of the big species to have the biggest effect. And so if we're talking about the high seas, in some ways, we don't even know the role that sharks play because we lost all those massive mako sharks before we started doing the science. And it was probably those big, massive mako sharks that were eating some of the other big predators there that would have really made a difference. And so we can't even measure the importance of sharks in some situations, but we draw parallels to land. And what we do know about sharks is generally when you take out the big individuals of big species, bad things happen. And that goes throughout the ecosystem. And that means it affects us because we don't have as much fish to catch, or we don't have that habitat like seagrass that we know has benefits of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and then burying it in the sediment or providing that nursery habitat. So I think we definitely do need good sized MPAs in the high seas if we're going to get this right.
And what role do you both think community has in those MPAs? I mean, Wendy, you mentioned the large MPAs off the coast of South America. And Mike, you were talking about these communities that you work with in Australia that have this unique relationship with sharks. Or maybe it's not unique. Maybe that's how a normal functioning relationship or coexistence between sharks and humans is. But what role do you both think communities have in protecting these shark species?
Well, certainly what I have seen is that you need to have the local community involved, because they are the ones that are going to care and protect it. And I'm thinking also of the added detail here that I tend to be in favor of having, even in a well-regulated marine protected area, to have artisanal fishers allowed to fish. because I think that helps them to really stay connected to the ocean. It's part of their life. It's a food source. I think that helps them to protect the bigger area if they feel more involved that way. Now, I think there are some protected areas where that's not necessary, but others where I think it would be a smart idea to allow that. What do you think, Mike?
There's no question you've got to work with the local communities and have them take the lead as much as possible. I mean, sometimes they don't have the resources or the information. And so coming in as a partner and collaborator is really important because things won't last if you don't have local groups really take ownership of this. And I think one just spectacular example of working with the community, Damian Chapman at Moat Marine Lab has been working in Belize for years. And they've really partnered not just with the Belizean government, but with the local fishing communities. And in some situations, they've basically turned the people that were fishing and catching sharks into the shark research team for the country. And so they're actually doing the tagging and the monitoring of these animals to be able to figure out what the patchwork is, where you can have some shark fishing in some areas and not in others. And I think that it's really repeated around the world. You can't just have people from the US and Canada and Australia go and tell people what to do. It really has to be collaborative. And this is one of the things when we talk about shark ecotourism that's really important. You say, okay, these sharks are worth more alive than dead because people will pay money to come and do it. But you have to think who is benefiting from that tourism. You can't have fishers that were making their livelihood and were dependent on that just pushed out, and then other people come in and make the money in the tourism industry. So this really is about people working together. And my experience is people want healthy oceans. Usually they want generations after them to have healthier oceans than they had. And so it's how we navigate the issues and help people with the issues they're facing. You can have both. You can have great economies and human communities and healthy oceans. And that patchwork of what works may be different in one area to another based on local traditions, cultures, and the environment around them.
One wonderful example is Raja Ampat in Indonesia. That was started by two dive masters who saw shark finning on this island, and they just couldn't bear it. So they camped out there with a wonderful German carpenter, and they built Misul Eco Resort. And of course, they talked with the people who lived there, and all of the indigenous people were thrilled to have a marine protected area to bring back the ocean because they had seen their ocean just deteriorate as these shark finners came in and massacred sharks and other marine creatures. One of my dive masters had been a shark finner. So the people who had done the shark finning were hired to come in and run the hotel, run the kitchen, became dive masters. So it was a really fulsome, exciting experience to see this. Now, not every place can be so beautiful as Raja Ampat and Misul Eco Resort. But as Mike's saying, there's a whole variety of ways to do this. And of course, on land in Africa, the most successful preserves there are where the local people are involved in helping to protect it, in caring about the animals, in running the hotels so they make some money, et cetera, et cetera. As we talk, it strikes me again, as Sylvia Earle often says, we know what we need to do. We have the tools. We know how to do it. We have good examples of successes. And it's just a matter of scaling it up and doing it at a larger, more important scale. So that's what everybody is trying to do now, is to really just scale it up. And if you look back, when you think of the rainforest, the Brazilian rainforest, it took probably 20 years for people to realize, oh, this is what we absolutely must do. We must save these huge tropical forests. Now, bad things are happening now. But I'm thinking the parallel with the ocean, that around the late 90s and early 2000s, we realized, and it's taken us 20 years to get up to speed. And I think we're up to speed now. As Mike was saying, we have so many more technological instruments and ways to monitor and to see what we're doing. The problem is we have too many subsidized fishing vessels out there. I know Maria Damanaki, who was the head of the EU, I can't remember exactly which section, but she did a lot to try to get governments to step back on subsidizing the boats, because without the government subsidies, these boats are actually not economical. There are many little rabbit holes we can go down here. Lead us onward, Katie.
I know. I think I could talk about this forever. This is such an interesting subject. And it seems to me like it's all boiling down to this intersection between local communities, scientists, and storytelling or education, one of the two. And so that brings me to a question I think is really important, and I would love for you both to answer. Mike, you're also the author of a book. So what role, whether this is through storytelling, through films, through books, or social media, what role do you both think storytelling has in shaping a healthy ocean in our future?
Well, I think it's central. And there's the cliche, you love what you know, you protect what you love. And I think that I got to get my social media back up to speed. I need more time to get that out. But I guess I've always felt when I first got to go to these places in remote Australia, it was a privilege to be there. And I had a responsibility to share that. And I remember very vividly being out there with one of my friends and just having an amazing day working on turtles, tiger sharks, the dolphins are everywhere. And just saying, if we could just bottle 5% of how amazing this is, it would be transformative for others. And so I got into doing some documentary films with National Geographic and still am privileged enough to do Shark Fest shows pretty much every year. And I also really got involved in education. And so we've really been trying to figure out how do we bring that excitement of the field and seeing these animals into classrooms in an authentic way, not just talk at or documentary. And so we've kind of tried to create this almost choose your own adventure, figure out your own mystery. And so writing the books for kids has been part of that. And really, it's just everything we can do to reach people in different areas, because I think that what we've seen with reducing demand for fins has been about people learning about what the issues are or caring about them. And it's something that we're always grappling with is what's the best way to reach people now? Because it used to be the documentary films were great. I mean, luckily now Shark Fest is on Disney Plus, and so people can stream it, or we work with PBS and things live online. But where do we meet people where they are and spark that curiosity? Because to me, if we can spark curiosity, people are going to be inspired to learn more on their own. And that's going to lead to figuring out how people can make a difference, because that's what I do see. Most people, they want to make a positive difference somewhere. And so if we can provide that inspiration and then some of the tools of how they can make a difference, we'll get where we need to go. I'm very hopeful, but there are major challenges we're facing still. So there's still a sense of urgency to get where we need to go to have healthy oceans and ecosystems around the world. And that includes having sharks in it.
Oh, Mike, I'm thrilled to hear you write books. I'm going to go look up your books. Okay. So that makes me think how exciting it's been for me to have Jaws as a stepping off place to bring other people into the conversation of sharks. I've done many, many different speeches, but one in particular really struck me because I was just doing an intro to Jaws the movie. So it was an audience of people who loved Jaws the movie, but hadn't necessarily any interest in sharks, which surprised me sort of. And so I had so many questions, just basic questions about the ocean and sharks and why are they important. And I thought, this is what I want to do with Jaws. I mean, Peter tried to do it with Jaws. He always said, we have to use Jaws in whatever way we can to get people who are not marine scientists or not really connected to the ocean to understand it. And I think he would be thrilled to know that I have been I'm a producer of a new documentary that's coming out, and it is called Jaws at 50, The Definitive Inside Story.
Wow.
It's produced by National Geographic and Disney and Amblin Entertainment, and Laurent Bouzereau is the director, and I'm an executive producer. And it's coming out June 20th. It will premiere up in Martha's Vineyard. It's going to be a wild weekend on the vineyard because that, of course, is where Jaws was filmed. So they have all kinds of different activities going on. But I'm also going to be taking this documentary to many of the theaters along the East Coast of the United States and able to talk about sharks. My motto is, if you love Jaws, you love sharks. That's where you ought to be with it. So if anybody out there is listening to this podcast and you would like me to bring this documentary to, say,
Miami?
Miami. Well, what I'd like to do is I would love to show this documentary and give talks at the Chamber of Commerce meeting across the USA, or at the biggest doctors' conference that happens in the USA, to audiences that don't normally get involved in ocean issues. It's a fun documentary. Stephen is absolutely superb in it. And one of the wonderful things that I could say to Stephen is, Stephen, you do not have to apologize anymore for Jaws. It really was great for shark research and for initiating interest in the ocean. And so be happy. And he knows that. But it was a murderous film to make, as you all know.
Hey, documentaries are like hot dogs. If you like them, you don't want to know how they're made. That is
right. Yeah. I feel very excited about the potential of this documentary to bring more people into understanding the ocean and sharks.
That's a beautiful story. Congratulations on this new film. I'm so excited to see it. Mike, I'd love to ask, looking ahead to the future, what gives you hope for sharks, and what's something that everyone can do, even a small action, to help protect them?
I think that what makes me hopeful is just the gains we're seeing in areas around the world. And those white sharks on the coast of the US are one of those success stories. So just talking to my friends, Megan Winton and Greg Skomel, working there off the Massachusetts coast, just to see these sharks back in our waters is spectacular. So that gives me hope. It shows we can do this. And combined with the ground level support to make things better that we see around the world with our collaborators, of communities getting involved, not just scientists, not just governments, gives me a lot of hope. There's a lot of work to do, but we can do this. We're going to do this.
And Wendy, what do you think is something everyone can do to either get involved in the conservation of sharks or to be more hands-on in their protection? What's one thing everyone can do?
People ask me this all the time. And usually I say to people, and I do think, that there are so many different ways to get involved. You don't have to be a scientist on the ocean in order to have impact and to help the ocean. So either you can find out what local group there is in your town that does beach cleanup or stream cleanup. If you have any money, you can send it to the NGOs who are out there around the world doing the best job they can to bring the ocean back. You can follow people on social media and then expand the social media so more people understand what the issues are. And I think that we have made such progress, and marine protected areas, to me, are where we can continue to just develop hundreds and thousands of hectares of ocean to protect and to propagate more fish and to keep the ocean healthier. So that's where I see us headed. And I certainly hope the UN High Seas Treaty, that countries vote yes on it, and that even if we can't initiate the whole high seas, that we can have big swaths of the high seas, as Mike was saying, under protection. And I think the coast of South America has shown us the way there. And I hope that we'll have that kind of cooperation in other sections of the world. I think we're doing it. We're making big progress, and it will continue. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you both. I've loved this conversation. Like we've said, I could talk for hours, but I think this is an amazing introduction into the world of sharks, into the way Jaws has shaped our perception, and the science that occurs around these sharks. So I'm hopeful for lots more science in the future, more storytelling. And thank you both for all the work that you do for our ocean environments and for the sharks. It's going a very long way.
Oh, thanks, Katie. It's been great. Wendy, look forward to catching up soon.
Yes, Mike, it's been wonderful. And I've learned a lot from you, Mike. So I really look forward to being with you more.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Seakeepers Voyages of Discovery. Join us next time as we spotlight the next generation of ocean advocates and explore how the Georgia Aquarium is inspiring students to dive into conservation. Until then, fair winds and following seas.